welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and let's talk about counterspells in the format, and particularly that usually I find people are using them incorrectly. I talked about Strix's Serenade in my Modern Horizons 3 review. New counterspell, of course, it's going to be a popular one in the format. 1 blue mana instant, counter target artifact, creature, or planeswalker spell. Its controller creates a 2/2 blue bird creature token with flying. And what I said in that video is that I prefer Swansong because the stuff that I'm gonna typically want to counter in a commander game are going to be instants and sorceries and even enchantments. Those are, for me, usually the biggest threats in a commander game, and so that's what I want to be countering. But of course, a lot of people like Strix Serenade because it counters creatures, and of course, pretty much every commander deck has a creature in the command zone, so this allows you for 1 mana to counter your opponent's commander. And I said in that video that I just don't like that play. I don't like the play of countering my opponent's commander. I don't know if I have ever countered my opponent's commander. Now, I will first preface this by saying I don't play a ton of counterspells typically in my decks. I will say though, and I just touched on this in my video talking about how black is best, whenever a color does something really, really well, and of course, the best thing that blue can do, especially in the commander format, is countering stuff, you definitely got to put that in your commander decks. I think you're missing out on the best thing that blue does. However, don't overdo it, and I'm going to make a case for why not to overdo it, and you don't need to overdo it if you use your counter spells correctly, right? If you don't waste them, then you don't need to have 15 of them in your deck. You only need to have 3 or maybe 4. And one of the things that I think people waste their counter spells on is countering a commander. When I counter something, I want to know that I'm never going to see it again. Now, yes, it is possible that they get that card back out of their graveyard and use it. Okay, that's a bit of a fringe scenario, right? If my opponent's playing their mono black deck and they have a Torment of Hellfire and they're casting it, that's definitely something I want to counter, and it's almost a guarantee that they're not going to be getting it back out of their graveyard, right? With commanders, of course, it just goes back to the command zone, so they can just cast it in a couple of turns. So, of course, it's not dealing with an issue, which counterspells do really, really well. In fact, some people would argue it is the best way in all of Magic to deal with what your opponents are doing. Counterspells don't deal with your opponent's commander. It's just temporary, right? It's almost like casting a remand. You're just giving it right back to them so that they can cast it again on the following turn, or maybe 2 turns, I guess. All it is doing is slowing them down a bit. It is, in my opinion, one of the worst things that you can counter because your opponent is almost guaranteed to be casting it again in a couple of turns. Now, I know people will make the case for there are certain commanders that you gotta counter. Sure, absolutely. You could do that if your opponent's playing Najeela, for example. There's a really powerful commander that as soon as it gets out, starts going to work, things will get out of hand fast. I would say removal is probably a better way to deal with that, but you could counter it just to slow them down for a couple of turns. I don't know if it's going to help, to be quite honest, because if they're playing Najeela in a casual commander game, you're in big trouble already. There's always going to be fringe examples, but I think countering your opponent's commander is a bad way to use your counter spells. I like to save those counter spells for those game-ending scenarios. Either the big splashy spells that are just going to end the game, which of course there's a bunch of those kicking around, or the absolute blowout for you. Farewell, Cyclonic Rift, those are a couple of the big ones that you're going to see a lot in commander games that obviously is just a massive blowout, right? Your opponent just removing your entire board, that can be a game-ending scenario. I mean, it might not end the game right away, but it probably will get there soon. That's another thing I like to save my counter spells for. People also might like Strix Serenade because it counters artifacts, and of course, turn 1, I can counter my opponent's Soul Ring, which I made a video a long time ago talking about this. A play I've seen in the commander format a few times is 0 mana I counter your Soul Ring, which of course can be done with a Force of Will. It's one of the worst plays I have ever seen in the commander format. I think it's terrible. You have to remember you're in a multiplayer format here. You have 2 other opponents. So you're slowing down 1 person, sure, but those other 2 guys, they're loving it. You just threw away your best counter spell, and also your opponent doesn't get their Soul Ring, so it's a double whammy for them. It's a bonus bonus on top of another bonus for both of those other opponents. They're loving that play. Now, most people will say, okay, well, every counterspell is like that because every counterspell is going to be hurting one person and the other two guys aren't going to be hurt by it. But that's why I want to use my counterspells for things that directly affect me. That's how I get more value out of my counterspells. Someone is directly affecting me with what they're doing. That's why I'm going to be countering it. I'm not going to counter a thing that just is kind of good for them. Countering a Soul Ring, in my opinion, terrible play. Don't waste your counterspells. I mean, if you don't waste them, then you can play less counterspells. And if you play less counterspells, then you get to put more fun, interesting stuff in your deck. That's sort of the way I think about it. Basically, it comes down to threat assessment, right? Which, of course, is a big topic that I have covered before on my channel that covers a whole lot of things. Removal, for the most part, I think is a big one that goes into threat assessment, but counterspells obviously fit into that category as well. It's a tough one, without a doubt. And often with regards to threat assessment and also with regards of just putting too many counterspells in your deck, you get into what I call the counterspell trap. And a lot of decks that run too many counterspells can get into this trap. Because of course, as I've talked about before, even though people really, really love counterspells, they are only good in that very specific moment when someone's casting stuff. Once that thing's already been cast or once that permanent's already on the board, a counterspell doesn't do anything. That's when you need obviously other removal. So in order for counterspells to work, you gotta leave mana open all the time, right? So what I see all the time in the Commander format, the counterspell trap, I call it, I got a just straight up counterspell in my hand, so I gotta leave that 2 blue mana open. Pass turn, what does my opponent do? It just ramps, does nothing worth countering. Okay, fine, wait for the next guy. What does he do? Nothing scary. And then the next guy plays an Arcane Signet, and I'm sitting here going, okay, I left mana open to counter something, and then nobody cast anything that was worth countering. Now what do? It kind of feels like I could have done more, right? I could have done more on my turn, but instead I left mana up to counter something, and nothing was worth countering. And again, what I've seen many, many times is that person just ends up countering whatever. That Arcane Signet, I'll counter that because they don't want to feel like their turn was wasted by leaving that mana open. And it can get really unlucky sometimes, the turn order. If you happen to be the guy who is right before the guy who's playing all the counter spells, right? His turn is next. Because he's leaving mana open and because he's trying to counter things, a lot of times he'll just end up countering all your stuff because you're the guy whose turn is right before his. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this happen before. The unlucky guy whose turn it is right before the guy who's playing all the counter spells. That can be rough. But of course, the other issue with playing too many counter spells, and probably the big reason I don't do it, I mean, ultimately it's just kind of unfun. A lot of people don't love it, but because a lot of people don't love it, it sort of falls into rule number 1 for me, right? Rule number 1 for me in Commander is don't make yourself a target. It's rule number 1 with regards to building a deck. It's rule number 1 with regards to playing a deck. Don't make yourself a target because it's a 4-player game and 3v1 kind of sucks. And if you are the guy, and we all know this, right? I'm not telling tales out of school here. We all know how it works. If you're that guy playing the mono blue deck who's just countering everyone's stuff, you're going to be the arch enemy really, really fast. And you might be able to fend off people for a while, but you're going to run into the situation where you have that Strix Serenade in your hand, and that's when your opponent decides to cast their enchantment or instant or sorcery that you can't counter. So playing too many counterspells is also going to make you the arch enemy, and also it is not a fix-all, okay? Keep that in mind. I know a lot of people look at counterspells and they think it just fixes every situation, but it doesn't, all right? It doesn't fix the situation where you don't have the mana open when they cast that specific thing, or you don't have that particular counterspell that counters that thing in your hand at the time it's being cast. A whole bunch of things have to align properly in order for this to work. And of course, it also doesn't work if your opponent has something that can't be countered. If your opponent's playing some tribal deck and they get their Cavern of Souls out and your game plan is, I just counter everything my opponents do, what are you going to do with that guy? He's just going to run you over, right? You're going to have no answers for him. So big takeaways from this video is don't put too many counterspells in your deck. It will make you the arch enemy on top of being just unfun, I think. And in a casual Commander game, we kind of want to keep it fun, right? But you're able to put less counterspells in your deck because you're using them wisely, right? Proper threat assessment. Don't counter things that don't affect you directly is my advice. That's what I typically do. And try to avoid the counterspell trap. Of course, counterspells are powerful, without a doubt. I'm not saying they're not, but I would argue that in the commander format, there are actually better options. Counterspells for me are better in other formats than they are in the commander format. I know people will say, okay, well, what's better than just stopping your opponents from what they're doing? There's actually a lot of options that are better than that. For example, someone's casting that farewell. Well, you just cast your counterspell, and what's better than that? Teferi's Protection is better than that, because if I cast a Teferi's Protection, I phase out all my stuff and everyone else loses their stuff. That's a way better play in a commander game. So just keep that in mind as well. Counterspells might feel like a fix-all, like a solution to every problem, but in the commander format, we do have access to lots of cards, and there might be better ways to deal with certain situations. That is my advice for you. Play those counterspells correctly, because man, I see people do it incorrectly a whole lot. You guys let me know what you think in the comments below. That is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.